What the Lord wants me to do tonight is to look a little more at the subject of the oath and Christian ethics, because I think that with us going out of town next week, it looks like we have three messages that I want to be through with before we go in Christian ethics. So tonight what I want to do is look at the sixth and final of the formal arguments against the oath, which won't take us very long. We'll do that rather quickly, and then I want to move into some of the, you could either call them philosophical or common sense arguments against the oath, about a half a dozen of those, same number as formal arguments. You could call those informal, I guess. And we ought to be through with that rather quickly. And then look at some, if we've got time for all of this tonight, look at some of the deeper meanings of Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5:33 through 37. And then if we get through with that, then we're going to be going quickly tonight, I suppose. I want to read you a paragraph or so from my notes 6 years ago whenever we taught on the oath and Christian truthfulness. And then on Sunday morning, what I would like to do is kind of look at a sociological, historical look at some things that are real prevalent in American society today. We'll still be on the subject of ethics, and we'll still be on the subject of truthfulness, but, well, Time magazine, I know a few months ago, has come out with some very interesting articles, and right in accord with what we've been saying all along, that as soon as you get off the path, regardless of what all the bleeding heart liberals out there want to say, whenever you get off the path of the absolutes of right and wrong, then you're headed into a moral swamp. And they've written some very interesting articles in light of this very interesting spring of 1987 that the United States of America has experienced. Everyone from President Reagan to Jim Baker is caught lying, being immoral, being dishonest, disloyal, hypocritical, and everything that you could name in the book, I think. And we're seeing this just again and again and again. So I hope that will be an interesting study for us. We did a message a few months ago entitled something like American Religion, a Train Off Its Track. And that's what we're seeing in America today. The important decisions, the eternal decisions of value and of right and wrong, they're not being thrashed out and discussed down in Washington. They're being discussed in every local church of Jesus Christ, to the extent that that church stays faithful to the biblical revelation. Then although it might be a group of relatively ignorant people, relatively poor people, relatively outcast people, they are the ones who have the truth, because they're part of the pillar and the ground of the truth. And it's interesting that in all these great political circles and these universities and graduate schools, as we'll show you, and we've been saying it all along, and some of these unchristian moral philosophers, like at Harvard and like Boston University's president, recognize the same things. It's too bad it's not changing their life, so they have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, this moral one that they're all aiming for and talking about, and of course we can't. But the church, to the extent that it stays faithful to the biblical revelation, will be the place where the great eternal issues of right and wrong are discussed. And we want to do a brief study Sunday morning there, and then next Wednesday night, which will be our last study before we go on a little vacation, we'll kind of conclude some things in this section of Christian virtues. And I think both what we say on Sunday morning and Wednesday night will then prepare the way for our next topic that we'll get to whenever we get back. So that way, whenever we get back, we'll be starting brand new, fresh. And I was telling my wife today, we'll have to take a break in KJV guidelines probably. We won't get through all of those. But that's something that's easy to pick back up with. This I don't want to stop. This I want to come to a concluding point before we go on our trip, so that when we do come back, we can start fresh. So tonight then, the sixth and final, this first of all tonight, formal argument prohibiting the oath. I'm not even going to take the time to review the first five, but we're down in Matthew 5:37b. Oh, I was going to ask you this before I got going. Has everything been said clearly enough up until this point? This business of taking the oath, of signing forms that say certify, of making sure you're somewhere on time if you tell someone. If you've got any questions, you need to ask. You don't sense that you're being bound unscripturally, do you? I had to fill out a legal form yesterday, as a matter of fact. Had certify on it in Rutland. I'd gone to do something in Rutland, and it was a portly, kindly lady, and so I said, well, I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't sign anything. My religious beliefs will not allow me to sign anything with the word certify on it. I said, would you allow me to please mark this out and just write the word state, that I state I'm telling the truth? She smiled and said, well, yes. And I said, thank you. And so I signed it, I marked it out and put state, and then I was going to sign my name to this document. And she said, well, before we go on, she said, may I ask why? And I said, you certainly may. And so she said, why? And I said, because Jesus the Lord said in Matthew 5:37, and I gave her the passage and quoted it to her. And I said, and this is the thrust of it. What he's advocating there is simple speech, that we should be known as truthful people by our character. And if we're so known for being so truthful, we will not need to compound our sentences with oaths and certifications and affirmations. She said, very interesting. She said, where is that verse again? I want to look that up when I get home tonight. So she looked for a piece of scratch paper and wrote it down, and I'm sure she looked it up that night. So if everything has been discussed clearly enough thus far, we'll continue tonight then. Here's what would have happened to me if I would have signed that yesterday. Let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, and say certify your yea. Just let your yea be yea. Because whatever is more than this comes from evil. That's what I would have been saying and what would have happened to me yesterday if I didn't know what the message said. Message of the New Testament is live a simple life with simple speech that's non-complicated, but that's truthful to its core. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. So here's what I would say for this sixth formal argument. We're giving arguments. Was his positive command, 37a. The sixth one, the origin and result of disobedience. Now I say both of those terms because James phrases it somewhat differently in his 5th chapter than does Matthew in his. The origin, that would be Matthew, and result, that would be James, of disobedience. The origin, Matthew, and the result, James, of disobedience. This would be a formal argument. By formal we mean found right here in the passage. We don't have to go outside of the context. And that's what all of these Protestant commentators are wanting us to do, is be sure that you're arguing contextually. Don't argue on the basis of what the Friends say or the Mennonites say, but argue contextually. So to the best of our ability, that's what we're attempting to do. We're basing these 6 arguments right on the context of what's being said here. In other words, let's drop origin for the moment and stay with result, which is what James is going to give us. That would be an argument, the fact that what James says over there is if you give anything more than simple speech, then you stand in need of judgment from God. That'd be enough to keep you away from taking an oath then. And there's a formal argument against it because you know that if you disobey God, he'll punish you for it. Or Matthew has it differently here. You know that if you disobey God, it's because you've been influenced by evil. And the evil is what influenced you to take an oath. So that would mean an oath is wrong. The formal argument would be the oath is wrong because its origin is evil. And what they're telling us is, wait a minute, now God takes the oath, so the origin of an oath is good. Well, what did Jesus say here, though? He said, say yes and say no, for whatsoever is more than this cometh of evil. He said, whatever is more than yes or no comes of evil. So their argument of let's go back, and they're the ones contextually who are way off base here, by jumping out of the context, going back into the Old or going ahead into Revelation, and saying, now God took an oath, and the angels take an oath, and so the origin of oath-taking is good. No, Jesus said no. He contradicts that. He denies that. He said whatever is more than yes or no has an evil origin to it. Whatever these other commentators want to say, Jesus said whatsoever is more than these plural, the yeses and the nos, whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil.
Praise God.
So that's the little phrase that we're on. Whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. Now, let's just take a very quick chasing down the trail of a rabbit here. Christian Ethics tape number 90, CE 90. We discussed this matter that I'm going to go into very briefly here. CE 90, so you can find it in detail there. When we were looking at Matthew 6:13, the little series that we did, Lord, Teach Us to Pray, we have a very similar phrase in Matthew 6:13, in that it ends with evil. Deliver us from evil. Whatsoever is more than these cometh of. What's another way of saying from? Cometh from evil. Its origin is evil. Deliver us from evil. Matthew 6:13. Well, there are two different ways of looking at this. This is what the Greek has, tu poni rou. Which looks like this, T-O-U-P-O-N-E-R-O-U, tu poni rou. Poniros is evil. This is just a definite article, the, which sometimes is understood to be omitted because evil, like, well, heaven would, in the New Testament Greek, have the article, but we wouldn't say the heaven, because heaven is a generic, generalized term. So you'd use the thee to be proper in Greek language, but you'd drop it in speech. You'd drop it as you read it and thought about it. You don't call it the heaven or the hell. It's so general that we know we're talking about heaven and hell, something that's general. And of course, evil can be the same way. You wouldn't say the evil. If you're talking about evil as something that's a neuter or an abstract or, you know, an immoral principle, then you would drop this in your understanding, the definite article the, although you would leave it in your writing. Now here's what is a little confusing about this, because it's singular and it's found in the genitive case here with the OU endings. It can either be taken as a neuter, which would just mean evil, such as in Romans 12:9, 1 Thessalonians 5:22. Now this is all on that tape, and I probably spent a lot more time on it there, but I'm just going to do it briefly tonight. Or it can be taken as a masculine, because the case ending would be the same. In other words, you can't tell from just this being written, is it neuter or masculine? The endings are the same. Feminine would be different, but neuter and masculine are the same in several different cases. Such as in Ephesians 6:16, 1 John 5:19. So I gave you two cases where the tu poni rou should be a neuter. You can kind of tell from the context that it should be neuter. And other places where you can tell from the context it should be masculine. Ephesians 6:16 and 1 John 5:19. Now if it's to be taken as a neuter, then of course we just omit the thee and it's understood evil. Whatever is more than this, you know, comes of evil. It's because of the evil that's in the world that in some people's minds seems to necessitate the fact that they should take an oath. If it's masculine, and we still have our definite article, but masculine means personality somehow involved. And so just in what the literal Greek has of the evil, we wouldn't have enough. But what would be understood is the evil one. It would be a personality if it's masculine. The evil one, whom we would know, of course, is Satan. Now, the definite article would seem to imply that we're talking masculinely, the evil one, but that's not necessarily true. So you can't prove a whole lot by the definite article. You're either going to have to go by the context, and that doesn't necessarily help, or you're going to have to go by The other part of speech, the of, found in Matthew 5:37b, or the from, found in Matthew 6:13. In other words, the prepositions. Let's do the context first of all. Contextually, what do you think it would be here, neuter or masculine? Maybe I should interrupt you before you even answer. I don't want to make you to make a fool of yourself. Whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. Well, that's, I would say, impossible to know. From the context, should this be just cometh of evil in general or comes from Satan? I don't know that you could tell from the context here, which he's talking about. Same is true with Matthew 6:13. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Is he talking about deliver us from evil in the world, deliver us from Satan? I don't know if the context is going to do you any good at all. But what could do you a little good, and what I think probably will do us some good, although this is probably not something, at least in the Matthew 5 case, that you'd want to be just 100% dogmatic about, and I'll show you here in a moment, it doesn't matter whether we can be or allowed to be dogmatic or not, because we're going to end up at the same place anyway. Well, let's go to the prepositions then. If the context is not going to do us a lot of good, let us go to the prepositions. Now, we could have two different prepositions here. Just spell them for you in English. EK or APO. Both that could mean of or from. Now, in Matthew 6:13, this is the one that we have. APO. Deliver us from evil. Or deliver us out of evil. You could end up with of in both places or from in both places. Just speaks of origin. EK, the ek, is found in Matthew 5:37. We've got two different prepositions here. Matthew knows what he's writing here, and he knows that it's ambiguous. I mean, he writes in Greek. He knows that the Greek for the genitive singular in masculine and neuter is ambiguous, because you can't tell, is it masculine, the evil one, speaking of a personality, or is it just generically evil in general? Well, this is a rule that's not always true, but it's true more times than it is not, that this preposition, APO, is used with persons. In other words, deliver me from John, and you would use this preposition. The EK preposition used with things. Now, that's not always true, but more times than not, this is true. Simple enough thus far? So it appears to be the case that in Matthew 6:13, what we should have here is lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from Satan, the evil one. Tu poneru with this preposition, speaking of persons, deliver us from the evil person, from Satan, from the evil one. With this preposition that speaks not of personality, but of things, of abstractions, of ideas or principles or something, then back in Matthew 5:37b, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil, of the evil that is in the world. Rather than, because it uses this preposition, rather than saying cometh from Satan. Now you say, what if we happen to be incorrect concerning this? Well, I think you'll end up at the same place either way. Who's the source of the evil in the world but the evil one? So this may seem and may be a little pedantic and narrow to spend too much time here. You can leave it evil, you can change it to evil one, and I think you'll end up the same place either way. But I would prefer Matthew 6:13, speaking of a personality, the evil one, and leaving Matthew 5:37 as evil in general. And I'll try to show you why as we go along here. Plummer, the commentator on Matthew, Plummer, he has an interesting little statement here. Seems to me that he's in agreement with what I'm saying, that we leave it as evil in general. He writes, the use of oaths is an index of the presence of evil. It's an index of the presence of evil. In other words, to the extent that you have to use an oath, you're measuring the evil that exists in society because you're already thinking in your mind people are not truthful. And so to the extent that you have to use an oath, that is a barometer, a thermometer, an index that measures the presence of evil in society. I think he's right with what he says there, that the use of oaths is an index of the presence of evil. Amen. That where evil abounds, so do oaths and vows. And where those are absent, well, then you're not going to have the need of an oath. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. What I think that he's saying there is that the lying, hypocritical, false, sinful, fallen state of humankind and of the world is what produces the use of oaths. For whatsoever is more than just a yes or no comes of evil. That the use of oaths and of terms like affirm and certify, they're produced by the sinfulness of fallen humanity. And so that's why he can say, without talking about the evil one, although we know he is the one who plunged humanity into ruin, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. It's an index of the evil. It comes from evil that's in society. That if you didn't have evil in society, you wouldn't have oaths. And so since we are supposed to be a different group of people, we're supposed to be separate from society, the holy bride of Jesus Christ, then we shouldn't have evil in our midst, and wherever we go is our midst, not just when we're here, but wherever we go, we carry the light of the gospel with us. Then if that's true, that we are to be the holy bride of Christ without any evil or sin in our midst, then we should have no need of anything beyond a yes or a no. Now, let's turn over to James and see what James has to say about this. It's very, very clear here. I said when I started tonight that to the extent that the local church remains faithful to the biblical revelation, then there is the source of all light and truth in the world. Jesus said that we are the light of the world. Of course, we're not light if we read a little bit of his word and then mix it with some darkness of the world, though, and their worldviews and philosophies and opinions. So that's why I'm qualifying it. To the extent that we stay faithful to the biblical revelation, we are the source of all truth that's to be known in the world, all reliable teaching will be found in the church and not outside of it. James 5:12. Now, we were talking about the origin of disobedience. We're arguing against taking the oath, Matthew 5:37, because of the origin of the oath, it's evil. That means when you take the oath, you disobey God. You've been influenced by the evil that is around you in the world. Now, James says something different. He takes it from the beginning to the end. Matthew has the beginning, he has the end. James says if you disobey God, Matthew has already said you disobeyed because you're influenced by evil in the world. The origin of your disobedience is the evil influence that you're under in the world. James goes to the end and says, now if you disobey, you're going to be judged. You stand in need of judgment because you've disobeyed God. So I'm putting this together still as one and our sixth and final formal argument prohibiting the oath, the origin and the result of disobedience. James 5:12. But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath. See, we've just taken these verses apart, looked at each little phrase here. It's, you're supposed to be taught that. You're not, I don't guess, anymore, but taught how to think and how to study, and you just don't look at something and say, this is the way a lot of people do, well, what's my general impression from this? Because oftentimes that could be wrong. And your first impressions can oftentimes be wrong. And your third and fourth ones can oftentimes be wrong. You have to ask yourself a lot of questions about this. It can be put in the little homey, rhythmical way. I had 6 faithful friends. They taught me all I knew. Their names were how and what and why, when and where and who. I mean, we were taught back in school that adverbs answer certain questions and adjectives answer certain questions, and if you know what questions are being answered, then you know what form of speech you have there. And you know what's an adverb, which answers a question like how. He ran. How did he run? He ran quickly. Quickly is an adverb, not an adjective. And an adjective will answer the question, what? This is a man. What type of man? This is a big man. So we were supposed to learn that back in school. I had 6 faithful friends. They taught me all I knew. Their names are how and what and why, when and where and who. That's what I do with these verses here. You start asking yourself those 6 questions, how, what, why, when, where, who, instead of saying, what's my general impression of this? You see, there's a big difference in saying, what's my general impression, and saying, how, what, why, when, where, and who. But above all things, we get something out of but. Above all things, my brethren, swear not. I mean, we get something out of each of these. Neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay, and watch the end of it, lest ye fall into judgment. The result, not an origin now, the result of disobedience, lest ye fall into judgment. Now that phrase in James is parallel to the one in verse 9, which is what we discussed when we were at Lake George together with this passage. Clearly teaching that one is culpable in swearing or taking an oath. Groan not one against another, brethren, lest ye be judged. Don't groan lest ye be judged. James 5:9. James 5:12, don't take an oath lest ye be judged. The 2 verses are parallel. They're drawn together by the theme of judgment. Translated here in the KJV, of course, as you see, as condemnation. Lest ye be judged. Well, that would kind of round out then 6 formal arguments. I don't know what these commentators are going to do with this last argument. If you want to keep on insisting that it's okay to take an oath, James will keep on insisting you'll be judged for doing it. He said, lest ye be, let your yea be yea, your nay, nay, lest you be judged. Matthew said, whatever is more than this derives itself from the evil influence you are under in the world. If a person insists on continuing to believe this business that the oath is allowed, all you're cluing us into is the fact that you're under worldly satanic influence. That's all you're spouting off all the time. That's what you're writing in your commentaries. You're saying, we read it between the lines, I, Mr. John Smith, am presently under evil satanic influence because I'm insisting it's okay to take an oath, right? Jesus said you're under an evil influence and you'll be judged if you say anything more than your yes is yes, your no is no. Now, I'd like to get one more formal argument out of it, but we ran out of verses. That's the end of verse 37. I'd find another one if he went to 38. But he goes somewhere else in 38 with non-resistance. And we'll have a field day with that whenever we get there. The same commentators who disobey 33 through 37 do the same to 38 through 42. Let's move along to look at the informal, what I would call maybe the informal arguments. In other words, these are not contextual arguments. The contextual ones are the best ones. They're the reliable ones. They're the ones that look at the very words that drop from the lips of Jesus himself. And we base our life and our faith on that. Because philosophical, informal, common sense arguments could sometimes get you in trouble because they could contradict Scripture. So once we do the formal ones that are contextually true, then as long as our informal ones do not go against the formal ones, we're on safe ground. Now I have 6 here. Some of this I brought out before, but I want to list it for you in 6 different points. Number 1, I would say that by an interesting twist in the argument of reason, it could well be argued that if any oath is going to be allowed of Christ at all, it'd be the light one, the frivolous one, rather than the formal judicial one. I would say that by an interesting twist in the argument of reason, that it could be better argued that Jesus would allow us to continue with the light oath. Of course, you see, we already realize there's no difference between a light oath and a heavy oath. O's are O's. And there's no difference between an oath and just what you say. You're still bound by it. But I'm saying by an interesting twist in this argument that if we're going to argue that some type of oath is allowed, you'd be on much safer grounds to argue that the light oath continues in Christian existence today and that the judicial and formal one has been annulled. Why? Well, because oaths tend to bring forth dishonesty. That's what the courts have shown us. That's what Jesus teaches us. That's what humanity shows us. That the oaths tend to bring forth dishonesty. And so if they're used only in unimportant areas, then the damage that's done would be negligible. I mean, that would make all the sense in the world to me. Don't argue for formal oaths, because if you have a great, deep, important judicial one and you break that, you're in all kinds of trouble. That could affect all types of peoples and nations and events. But if it's just you and your buddy out on the playing field somewhere, I would think that if anybody could swear, you couldn't in court, but you could out on the field, though. And you see, these commentators are arguing the reverse. They're saying Jesus did away with the light oath, but he allows the formal judicial one in court. I think it'd be better to let the guys out on the baseball diamond argue with oaths and promises and swears to one another, because it's kind of understood those guys are lying to each other, and since you already kind of know that, then the damage that's done, if any, is going to be negligible. Amen. You see, where we would expect the truth most of all would be in court. And so when you take an oath and you're not telling the truth, more damage is going to be done than otherwise. For just the light expression of the frivolous oath, we realize that those guys on the baseball diamond are probably lying. And since we already know that, then we take their oaths with a grain of salt. We probably know that simply by virtue of the fact they're swearing to it that they're lying. So we would understand that. So we would all just laugh along, and whatever answer they gave us, we would reverse it in our mind and we'd have the truth. But in court, we wouldn't do that. We would think you were under a solemn judicial oath here. And so we would naively expect, too many probably would, naively expect that what they're telling us is the truth, because they're under a formal judicial oath.
For the continuation
naively expect that what they're telling us is the truth, because they're under a formal judicial oath. Therefore, in other words, you could lie better under a formal oath than you could under a light oath. It's easier to lie there because no one would expect it. Of course, we all expect it today, but I'm saying if this argument, if all of this would stay faithful and true, then I think that we would argue just from common sense that what Jesus is saying here is don't swear the formal ones, but swear the light ones. Of course, we think he says don't do either. But if I had my pick, I'd pick the light oath, because then I know you're probably lying to me. And if you're not and you break it, it's not going to affect much but just me and you or something. It won't affect the whole world like maybe an oath in court would. Okay, number 2. These are just some of my personal thoughts about this, why I would outlaw it even if I didn't have scriptural reasons here. If Jesus intends that the oath allowance remain intact, now that's what the commentators are saying, that the Old Testament teaching is still intact here. Well, if that's what he intends, then I think that we would surely find him encouraging greater allegiance to the oath rather than prohibiting their use, period. If Jesus intends that the oath allowance remain intact, then he's not going to confuse us with this very, what would be totally ambiguous language by telling us swear not at all. If he intends for the oath allowance to remain intact, then he's going to have to use some of the phrase in that, because that will throw any honest average reader and listener for a loop, because they're going to take him for what he said, swear not at all. We would expect that if he wants the oath allowance to remain intact, that what he would do here is encourage allegiance to the oath. That whenever you take your oaths, make sure that you abide by them, which is what verse 33 says when he is paraphrasing in summary fashion what the Old Testament law said. We certainly, if he's encouraging that the oath continue, but that, we simply stay more faithful to them, we certainly wouldn't expect him to say, Matthew 5:34, swear not at all. He's going to throw everyone for a loop then. We would expect him to say, continue to swear, but make certain that you are faithful to your oaths. We would expect him to encourage faithfulness and fidelity to the oaths that we take, rather than coming along and, at least on the surface, saying don't take any oaths at all. One commentator wrote, "Oaths are a token of the loss of truthfulness. If lying had not become a habit, there would be no need for oaths. Therefore, the remedy..." Well, I'm going to go over that again before I give you the remedy. I've said something like this before, and I read Plummer. Plummer said that the use of oaths is an index of the presence of evil. Oaths are a token of the loss of truthfulness. This is what I was explaining to the lady yesterday. I said, they're a sign that something's wrong. Why can't we just say yes and no and that be accepted? And, her obvious response was because people aren't trustworthy. And I said, that's exactly the whole problem here. And I said, now what's going to guarantee you, since you've already admitted that people are not trustworthy? If they're not trustworthy with their simple word, what guarantees you they'll be trustworthy with a compounded word? I said, in other words, you're imputing some type of voodoo ritualistic quality to the oath, that it can transform a liar into an honest man. And I said, that borders on voodoo and magic to think that could ever happen. Well, yeah, that's right. If your yes is really a no, why can't your yes under oath also be a no?
Amen.
So oaths are a token of the loss of truthfulness. If lying had not become a habit, there would be no need for oaths. Therefore, the remedy. Their remedy, what the commentators are saying, all right, the remedy is to keep on teaching the oath anyway. Well, that's no remedy. We're back in the same boat of problems. Therefore, the remedy is to outlaw the oath and speak the simple truth. That's the obvious remedy. The remedy's not to, let's try harder. We missed it the first couple of millennia with the oath. Let's try harder the next 2,000 years. That doesn't make any sense. If there's going to be a remedy, and there won't in the world out there, but if there's going to be a remedy in the Christian in his heart and life, it's going to be to outlaw oaths and to encourage simple truth. This commentator concludes. In other words, you find a few commentators who will follow this. This was an older one, I believe. Instead of inculcating greater fidelity to oaths, Jesus sweeps away swearing. The last is my paraphrase. That sweeps away swearing. I thought that'd be easier to remember. Instead of inculcating greater fidelity to oaths. See, he didn't come saying the Old Testament taught oaths, and now I'm going to come and teach oaths and then teach doubly so to maintain your vows. No, he said the Old Testament taught oaths, but I say unto you, swear not at all. Instead of inculcating greater fidelity to oaths, Jesus sweeps away swearing. He didn't come encouraging us to be faithful to our oaths. He came prohibiting oaths altogether and encouraging us to be truthful in our simple speech. Okay, a third common sense argument. Taking an oath suggests to all your listeners that your normal conversation is not to be trusted. Taking an oath suggests to everyone around you that your normal conversation is not to be trusted. Now I'm going to come back to this and give you a quotation from D. Edmund Habert, the Mennonite scholar, but I want to put it somewhere else. But remember that I'm going to come back and I'll read you this sentence again. Taking an oath suggests to all that your normal conversation is not to be trusted. If we can trust your normal conversation, then why would you need to swear to something then? We could trust your judicial conversation as well. Using an oath implies that your normal, regular speech is untrustworthy. Number 4. Another, by an interesting twist of the argument. Taking an oath actually often implies the person is lying. Taking an oath often actually implies the person is lying. They use it as an umbrella for their untruthfulness. Remember what happened to Gary Hart and Donna Rice, and what did he say? He said, I'm not guilty. He said, I've committed no wrong, and I'm prepared to take an oath about it. Well, as soon as he said that, I knew what he was saying is I'm guilty. But I want to make sure that no one thinks that I am by swearing to the fact that I'm not. As soon as someone says, I can prove that I am not guilty, I've committed no wrong, I'll take an oath to this. I knew that he had something to hide. You must have something to hide if you want to swear to these things. Why can't you just say, nothing happened? Of course, no one's going to believe you because we've got all of the, circumstantial evidence to the contrary. And so let's say you take an oath. Well, that doesn't stop the fact we still have all of the circumstantial evidence to the contrary, whether you take an oath or not. Taking an oath actually often implies that the person is lying. And so they take an oath to cover up the fact that they're lying. Number 5, taking an oath if nothing else. Now this is one of those lesser type arguments. If nothing else, if it doesn't prove or do anything else, taking an oath, if nothing else, lowers a Christian to the world's standard of dishonesty and distrust. That's if it does nothing else. And I think it does a lot more. It'll condemn you. It shows you're under satanic influence and a whole lot of other things. This is the lesser one. If nothing else, taking an oath lowers a Christian. Can't lower a person in the world. They're already there. It lowers a Christian to the world's standard of dishonesty and particularly distrust. Taking an oath, if nothing else, lowers a person to the world's standard of dishonesty and distrust. Sixthly and finally, on our informal argument, sin. I find it deeply interesting that on the very passage concerning truthfulness in the New Testament, that all of these opponents of ours, these evangelical quote-unquote commentators, stand before God and lie to us about taking the oath. I find that an irony of ironies. You might not see that as some deep argument against the oath, but I find it very ironic that on the very passage from Jesus' teaching that encourages truthfulness, these commentators come along and lie to us about, in their interpretation. You would think that of all things, since they already recognize that this passage is encouraging truthfulness, this would be the one passage you'd want to deal with very carefully in your exegesis for fear that you would lie about the truth. And the very passage that concerns truthfulness, they come and lie to us about and on the basis of by telling us it's okay to take an oath. Next of all, what I'd like to do, we got several different big sections, but they're fairly easy to do, is look at what I call the deeper meanings of this teaching. I don't want to go through it so quickly, and we really haven't done it that quickly, but so minutely be concerned with each word in each verse to the point of breaking up verses into various sections and subsections to dissect and study them, that maybe we miss an overall look at what is said. Now that's not first impression, that's an overall look at what is taught. So maybe I had better read this whole little section together in its entirety. Again ye have heard that it hath been said to them of old time, Thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, neither toward Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou canst not make one hair white or black. But let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. Now I see three deeper teachings here. Some we, of course, could even do full-blown studies on. I just don't think we're going to take the time to do that right now. the first one would be one that would perhaps fit under ethics, but I'll just have to try to place that somewhere else. And I think that that would be the fact that behind the doors, behind the scenes of what Jesus is saying, he's certainly saying don't take an oath and be truthful. He's certainly saying that. But I think in saying that, he's also teaching us through that the power of our words and of our accountability to what we say. The power of our words and our accountability to what we say. Words are very interesting things. If we say that Jesus rules out all oaths, what's left, for us in a passage like this? Well, or Matthew 23, well, the fact that words in the sight of God are the same as an oath. That for the Christian, every word is uttered before God. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 1 through 5. That our words have power, that we are bound to our words, and that they have an effect upon people around us. So I think Jesus is equating, the power of our words, with the oath here. Maybe equating is not the right word, but showing us by virtue of the fact he's teaching on the oath. And we recognize in human history how important that is. That truly our words must be extremely important and must have a lot of power to them. There's a deep mystery in words. Some scientists spend their whole life just studying words, the effects that they can have. All we're talking about are sounds, the vibration of your vocal cords as air is pressed out of your stomach region over your vocal cords, and they vibrate. And they vibrate the air in the cavities of your mouth and send out not really sound, but waves in the air that are then picked up by other people's ears, their hearing apparatus, and there's where it's translated into sound. Otherwise, if you don't have an ear, you don't have any sound then. Because what I'm saying is not sound, what you're hearing is sound, though. All that I'm doing, I'm just moving waves of air that come and register in your ears, that your ear translates into a sound, and then your brain can translate into a meaning. You could hear the word toko. What does that mean? Or tulomaki. Well, you heard the sound, tulomaki, but your brain can't do anything with that because it's never learned that before. I just put the syllables together. It's meaningless to you. So it's beyond just words. It's words that are understood by the other person. Whenever their mind has already been fashioned to know what those words mean and what they are, then what the book of Proverbs what does it have to say over and over again? But the fact that our words have power. That a soft answer can turn away wrath. A soft answer, soft words can turn away anger and wrath. And of course a harsh one would just stir things up more. Proverbs 18:21 tells us that there's deep mystery in our words. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Proverbs 18:21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. You can bless others and encourage them and have them leave your presence feeling good and spiritually edified on the inside. You can, in other words, minister life to them. Or you can make some critical remark that they didn't do something right, or you didn't appreciate this that they said, and they leave, and what did you do? But you ministered death and gloom to them and misery. Power in our words. Power in our words. That's the deeper meaning behind what he's saying here. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. And if we meditate on something like that more, then we should realize that there is power in a yes and a no. There's power in that. For the other person who hears you say yes, there's power in that. They take that to mean yes. They've learned enough just from being a human to know that they're to take that. If they heard that yes, those three letters, that syllable, that sound, that means, an affirmation. Yes, something is going to be done or was done. It's something positive. And then whenever you don't do it, well, there's confusion. Confusion will reign in human society then, whenever we've learned that that word means yes, and a yes is a positive. And then nothing ever comes of that. They never do it. They don't show up. They don't buy it. They didn't go. They didn't tell. They didn't, whatever yes said that they would. They don't do it. That brings confusion into human society. There's power in our words. We'll destroy our whole society, and we are doing that. We're in the very midst of doing that now in America.
Amen. Destroying
our society, destroying human relationships because they're built on words. You don't try having a relationship without talking to someone else. It's like relating to a corpse or a mummy or something. You don't have a relationship there. You relate to people. There are other ways, of course, but you relate to people with words. That's the most powerful way to relate with words. Powerful way. I mean, it's not touch, because you might touch 50 people on a busy sidewalk. You brush up against them. That doesn't mean anything at all. But if you stopped one of those people you touch and said, "I love you with all of my heart," well, something's going to happen right on the sidewalk there. There's power in words, a power that doesn't exist elsewhere. What do we have over in Revelation 12:11? But they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. By the word of their testimony. There is power in that. Psalm 51, as we have discussed before, there's power in the public confession of sin. There's a release, a spiritual release from demonic forces, just in one's confession and testimony. You see, every one of these little so-called package doctrines that you find in the charismatic movement have a true basis to them. You don't find in other churches, I mean, I never was a part of a church where anybody stood up and gave testimonies or anything like that. Just wasn't done, really. And so it just kind of becomes known that in charismatic churches, people are testifying all the time. They're testifying. And where do we get this word? Well, it's true. It's scriptural. It's biblical. Too many times that movement packages everything into little formulas. But if you can break it out of its formulas and its packages, you've got something a lot deeper than those people realize they have in their own hands. You've got dynamite that they don't even realize. And they themselves might write about the fact that there's dynamite in words and confession and praise, and they don't realize how much really is there. That there is dynamite in praise and in worship and in confession and in testifying to the Lord's goodness and to his blessings. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. That's not just some magical or mythical type thing. It's an expression of your will, of your heart, of your soul. When you stand up and say, "This is what I'm believing God for. This is what God did for me, and I thank him for this." I don't know that we're taught enough about the power of our words, so that we just kind of tend to let those things roll off of us. There's power in that, especially for the person who does the confessing. It might bless others around them, but there is particular power for the one who is confessing it. In Hosea 14 and verse 2, God said to return to me and don't forget to bring with you words. Hosea 14:2. He was not so interested, he said, in sacrifices and bullocks, but bring words. Maybe we need to read that. Some of you might not be familiar with that. Some of you are, evidently, because you're shaking your head. Israel, return unto the Lord thy God, for thou hast fallen by thine iniquity. Take with you words, and turn to the Lord. Say unto him, here's the confession, a prayer, take away all iniquity, and receive us graciously, so will we render the calves of our lips. Using a metaphor of the burnt offering. Well, now it's calves of our lips. And so in Hebrews 13:15, we read about the sacrifice of praise that we will offer continually. That is the fruit of our lips, the fruit of our mouth. Proverbs tells us that our words have healing and health in them. Our words have healing and health in them. Proverbs 15. Well, let's just turn there. I'd just as soon not quote these, rather look at them. Proverbs 15. Soft answer turneth away wrath, grievous words stir up anger. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. Verse 4, a wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness therein is a breach in the spirit. Verse 7, the lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the foolish doeth not so. In chapter 13 and verse 2, a man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth. These are some of the passages of origin for the charismatics in a lot of their teaching on confession. A man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth. Jesus is encouraging us to realize that there's power in our words in Matthew 5. But the soul of the transgressor shall eat violence. He that keepeth his mouth, I said that there's healing and health here, keepeth his life. But he that openeth wide his lips shall have destruction. In chapter 12 and verse 18, there is that speaketh like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health. But the tongue of the wise is health. Of course, he doesn't mean that your tongue, literally that thing in your mouth that flaps around, is healthier versus unhealthy, but the words that come out of it. It's a metaphor that speaks of speaking. Chapter 10, I believe, we'll find another verses 31 and 32 passage on this. The mouth of the just bringeth forth wisdom. The lips of the righteous know what is acceptable. The lips of the righteous feed many. Verse 21, the lips of the righteous feed many. Verse 11, the mouth of a righteous man is a well of life. And you can just run through here and find those verses.
Praise God.
Chapter 12 and verse 13. Healing and health and sickness and death are in our tongue. Proverbs 18:21. Proverbs 12:13. The wicked is snared by the transgression of his lips, but the just shall come out of trouble. 11:9. And hypocrite with his mouth destroyeth his neighbor. Verse 13. A talebearer revealeth secrets, but he that is of a faithful spirit concealeth the matter. And of course 10:19, a famous verse. The multitude of words there lacketh not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. In the multitude of words there lacketh not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. In other words, to just say it in a different way, he who talks a lot sins a lot. He who talks a lot sins a lot. The multitude of words, there does not lack sin. Sin will be present as a person talks more and more. Jerome, many centuries ago, had the following to say: evangelical truthfulness does not pledge itself with an oath, since every faithful word is equivalent to an oath. Advocating simple speech because there's power in words. You don't have to compound it and make there to be more power. There's power in simple words. Evangelical truthfulness does not pledge itself with an oath, since every faithful word is equivalent to an oath. Okay, a second deeper meaning here. I think that we see a little insight into the sovereignty of God. God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. How do we see this? By his relation to everything. Everything that can be mentioned here. By heaven, well, it's related because it's like God's throne. The earth, his footstool. Jerusalem, his city. Your head, your hair, you don't have power over it, but God does. What's behind all of that then? I mean, what's foremost in his mind there as far as God's relationship to the world, but that he is sovereign over his creation? That by virtue of the fact he is creator, then he stands in a very peculiar relationship to everything, unlike any type of relationship we could have with the world. He has created it, and so I think that we see here the message of God's sovereignty. One final deeper meaning is that man is habitually wicked. Man is habitually wicked. Let me give you a very interesting quote now. I said that I would give you here. This goes back to our third informal argument. Taking an oath suggests to all that your normal conversation is not to be trusted. One commentator writes, the fact that our courts, in good old secular USA, that our courts find it necessary to place a witness under oath to tell the truth is an obvious confession that they recognize that men are congenital liars. In other words, in a professedly non-religious society, what they're telling us with the procedure of the oath in court is that they have adopted and choose to believe the biblical doctrine of original sin. They don't even know what they're confessing. But they're confessing the fact that they believe the Pauline doctrine of original sin, that men are congenital liars. They're confessing that by putting people under an oath. I thought that was a beautiful way to say that. Because why have we said that he's outlawing the oath here? It's not because there was something wrong with the oath, it's because there's something wrong with man, that men tend to make it and break it. So the deeper teaching behind the teaching here would be that men are habitually wicked, or to say it as this man said, which is even better, I think, they're congenital liars. The courts recognize that. In an atheistic society like ours, they're saying we recognize that all men are born sinners. They're all born liars, as David said in the book of Psalms. So we have Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. There is none righteous, no, not one. We have Jeremiah 17:9. The heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Jeremiah 17:9. The heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? He's having to outlaw the oath. He knows that people are going to lie. And he'd rather, if you're going to tell a lie, than tell a lie under a yes or a no, not under an oath. Because of man's recognition of the oath. Not because of God's, but because of man's, that he tends to think that there's more power to that, and therefore we're going to be guaranteed someone's going to tell the truth. So to take the oath and to break the oath is to more deeply overthrow truthfulness. And Haggai 2:10-14, very unusual passage that is too little used probably in the church today. I'll just kind of paraphrase it and sum it up because we're running out of time. Haggai 2:10-14, Haggai asks the priest through a series of questions here that if you've got some holy thing in your hand that you're carrying and it accidentally touches someone else, does that make them holy? And he says, no. Priests say no. He said, well, what about you have some unclean thing in your hand? Then if you touch someone with that, does it make them unclean? Yes. In other words, what he's saying there is that holiness or righteousness doesn't rub off on other people. They don't just pick it up by accident. You don't fall into, as we've discussed earlier, holiness or righteousness. But when it comes to sin, that can be picked up very easily. Sin can be picked up, righteousness can't be picked up. Holiness cannot be picked up, unholiness can't. One rubs off and the other doesn't. Haggai 2, verses 10-14. And so since men are born liars, then they're going to continue to be liars, because like begets like, and unholiness and ungodliness is only going to produce after its own kind.